All right, let's begin today's session on cardiovascular embryology. Heart morphogenesis. I want you to remember that the heart is actually the very first functional organ to develop in vertebrate embryos. It starts beating spontaneously by week 4 of development. That's early. Before your brain is even fully organized, your heart is already pumping. The initial step is called cardiac looping. Imagine the straight primary heart tube twisting and bending to establish left-right polarity. This looping also begins in week 4. If something goes wrong with the molecular signals that determine left and right, such as a defect in the left-right dynein protein, this can cause dextrocardia, where the heart is positioned on the right side of the chest. One example of this is Cardigan syndrome, which also involves problems with cilia. Septation of the chambers, atria. Now, let's go step by step. 1. The septum primum starts growing downward toward the endocardial cushions, closing the initial gap called the ostium primum. 2. Before it completely closes, cell death occurs in the upper part of the septum primum, forming a new opening called the ostium secundum. 3. Meanwhile, another wall, the septum secundum, develops to the right of the septum primum, and it also leaves a small passage aligned with the ostium secundum. This alignment allows a right-to-left shunt in the fetal heart. 4. The septum secundum grows to cover most of the ostium secundum, but it leaves a residual opening known as the foramen ovale. 5. The remaining part of the septum primum acts like a one-way valve for that foramen ovale. 6. At birth, when the baby takes the first breath, left atrial pressure rises and right atrial pressure falls, pushing the septum primum against the septum secundum, functionally sealing the foramen ovale. 7. Over infancy and early childhood, the two septa fuse to form the permanent atrial septum. Clinical note. Sometimes, the septum primum and septum secundum don't fuse after birth. This results in a patent foramen ovale, which is surprisingly common, seen in about 25% of people. Most of them never know they have it. But in certain cases, it can allow a paradoxical embolus, where a clot from the venous system entering the systemic arterial circulation through right-to-left shunt, as can occur in atrial septal defect, ASD. So, in summary, the atrial septation process is a carefully choreographed sequence. Any disruption can lead to congenital defects. You should visualize these septa like sliding curtains that must meet perfectly in the middle at exactly the right time. After we've separated the atria, the next big task in heart development is dividing the ventricles. Ventricular septation. First, the muscular interventricular septum grows upward from the floor of the primitive ventricle. This growth leaves a gap at the top. This gap is called the interventricular foramen. Next, the aorticopulmonary septum rotates and fuses with the muscular septum, creating the membranous interventricular septum. This step closes the interventricular foramen. The endocardial cushions also contribute to both atrial and ventricular septation, as well as to the membranous portion of the septum. Clinical notes. Ventricular septal defect, VSD, is the most common congenital heart defect, and it usually occurs in the membranous portion of the septum. Atrioventricular septal defect, AVSD, also called an endocardial cushion defect or AV canal defect, occurs when there's incomplete separation between atria and ventricles. Partial AVSD means common AV valve with only an ASD. Complete AVSD means ASD plus VSD plus common AV valve. Associations: Down syndrome, maternal diabetes, and obesity. Outflow tract formation. Here's where neural crest cells come in. They migrate to form truncal and bulbar ridges that spiral and fuse into the aorticopulmonary septum, dividing it into the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk. If these neural crest cells fail to migrate properly, you can get conotruncal abnormalities. 1. Transposition of the great arteries, TGA. 2. Tetralogy of Fallot. 3. Persistent truncus arteriosus. Valve development. Aortic and pulmonary valves come from the endocardial cushions of the outflow tract. Mitral and tricuspid valves come from fused endocardial cushions of the AV canal. Possible anomalies: stenosis, narrowed valves; regurgitation, leaky valves; atresia, valve absent, for example, tricuspid atresia; displacement, for example, abstain anomaly. Now, let's talk about what each structure in the developing heart eventually becomes after birth. This is like matching the baby picture of the heart to its adult portrait. Embryonic structures and their adult derivatives. In the embryo, the right common cardinal vein and the right anterior cardinal vein develop into the superior vena cava. The posterior cardinal, subcardinal, and supracardinal veins together form the inferior vena cava. The right horn of the sinus venosus becomes the smooth part of the right atrium, which we call the sinus venerum. The left horn of the sinus venosus develops into the coronary sinus. The primitive pulmonary vein eventually becomes the smooth part of the left atrium. The primitive atrium forms the trabeculated parts of both the left and right atria. The endocardial cushion plays a big role, giving rise to the atrial septum, the membranous portion of the interventricular septum, and also forming the atrioventricular valves, as well as the semilunar valves. The primitive ventricle develops into the trabeculated parts of the left and right ventricles. The bulbus cordis forms the smooth outflow tracts of both ventricles. Finally, the truncus arteriosus becomes the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Fetal structures and their postnatal remnants. In fetal life, the ductus arteriosus functions as a connection between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. After birth, it closes and becomes the ligamentum arteriosum, which is located near the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. The ductus venosus, which shunts blood past the liver in the fetus, becomes the ligamentum venosum. The foramen ovale, which allows blood to pass from the right atrium to the left atrium before birth, closes and forms the fossa ovalis. The allantois, specifically the uricus portion between the bladder and the umbilicus, becomes the median umbilical ligament. The umbilical arteries transform into the medial umbilical ligaments. The umbilical vein, which carried oxygenated blood from the placenta to the fetus, becomes the ligamentum teres hepatis, also known as the round ligament, which is found within the falciform ligament of the liver. All right, Let's continue to the fetal circulation section. Now, this is where everything we learned about embryonic heart structures comes together. The fetal circulation is a clever system designed to bypass the lungs because in the womb the baby isn't breathing air, oxygen comes from the placenta. The three important fetal shunts. First, oxygen-rich blood from the placenta enters the fetus through the umbilical vein. Most of this blood bypasses hepatic circulation or the liver by traveling through the ductus venosus and enters the inferior vena cava, which carries it to the right atrium. Second, most of the highly oxygenated blood from the inferior vena cava passes from the right atrium directly into the left atrium through the foramen ovale. This shortcut allows oxygen-rich blood to go straight into the left ventricle and then be pumped out to the body, especially to the brain and upper body. Third, the blood returning from the head and upper body enters the right atrium through the superior vena cava. From there, it goes into the right ventricle and is pumped into the pulmonary artery. Because the fetal lungs are still filled with fluid and have high vascular resistance, much of this blood is diverted through the ductus arteriosus into the descending aorta. This supplies the lower body and then returns to the placenta via the umbilical arteries. Changes at birth. At birth, when a newborn takes the first breath, the lungs expand and the pulmonary vascular resistance falls. This causes left atrial pressure to rise and right atrial pressure to fall, pushing the septum primum against the septum secundum, which closes the foramen ovale. This closed remnant is now called the fossa ovalis. At the same time, the increase in oxygen from breathing and the drop in prostaglandins, due to the loss of the placenta, cause the ductus arteriosus to constrict and eventually close. In adults, its remnant is called the ligamentum arteriosum. Clinical note. Nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, such as indomethacin or ibuprofen, can help close a patent ductus arteriosus after birth. You can remember this with the phrase, indomethacin ends the PDA. On the other hand, prostaglandins E1 and E2 can be given to keep the ductus arteriosus open in certain congenital heart defects where it is necessary for survival.